Archivist Sorvin Kyle read the battle report 3 times before he set it down. He had been cataloging species for 31 years. He had written the final assessments for the Thari Collective after the siege at Venuk Station, had recorded the dissolution of the Palasi Compact following the Drivathi Council's 7th application of the Cascade Protocol, and had filed, with appropriate clinical distance, the extinction notices for 4 smaller species whose names appeared now only in the archive's lower shelves. He understood what battle reports looked like. He understood what they said when a species had been broken, when their fleet had ceased to function as a coordinated force, when their crews had stopped fighting and started dying in patterns consistent with total systemic collapse. This report said none of those things. This report said that 41 human vessels had entered the final engagement. The numerals on the recording surface, rendered in standard Drivathi notation with the small clarifying ticks beneath each digit, sat where Sorvin's eyes kept returning, as if the digits themselves might rearrange under the weight of what they preceded. The chamber beyond his archive was quiet at this hour. The filtration vents in the lower wall produced their soft cyclic hum, the same hum that had marked the chronicling sessions of the past 4 extinction notices, and the air around his desk carried the particular dryness that the long-term storage halls maintained against organic decay. That 22 of those vessels had been rendered non-functional during the first phase of the Cascade Protocol's deployment, precisely as the model predicted. That the remaining human commander, a flag rank officer named Drew Patel, had held position for 4 minutes and 12 seconds after the loss of his 22nd ship, during which time the Drivathi engagement commanders had filed their preliminary victory notation, standard procedural form, the one Sorvin had read 14 times across 7 species and found to be reliably accurate. Then, something had happened that the report described in 17 careful sentences, each of which Sorvin read again now, and each of which continued to say the same impossible thing. 14 human vessels had come out of that engagement. Not 14 limping vessels, not 14 hulls broadcasting distress signals from crews already lost to biological failure. 14 vessels with functioning weapons, functioning drives, and one commander still on his bridge who had, according to the damage telemetry logged by the Drivathi fleet's own instruments, absorbed a radiation exposure 3 times the lethal threshold for any known spacefaring species, and remained at his console for all 19 minutes it took to complete the reversal. Sorvin pulled a clean recording surface from the cabinet beside his chair and set it on the desk in front of him. He considered what he was about to write, and what it would mean for the file marked simply, as Council notation had designated it 4 years earlier, the short-lived. He decided to begin at the beginning. The Drivathi High Council had classified humanity formally 3 years, 8 months, and 11 days prior to the final engagement. Sorvin had been present at the session, seated in the lower gallery where chroniclers were permitted to observe but not to address the chamber. He had listened to Councillor Veth deliver the assessment from the primary podium, and he had recorded it faithfully. The species designated Homo sapiens, Veth had said, standing with the particular stillness of a person who had never had reason to doubt their own conclusions, are unsponsored, biologically fragile, and operationally short-lived. Their recorded interstellar history spans less than 2 centuries. Their technology is adequate for the space they occupy. Their command of coalition strategy is marginal. They are not a threat. They are a question that the Cascade Protocol will answer in the ordinary way. The chamber had registered no dissent. Why would it? The Cascade Protocol had answered the same question 7 times already, and the answer had always been the same. Veth was not a careless thinker. Sorvin had known her for a long time. long enough to understand that her confidence was earned in the specific way that institutional confidence is always earned, by being right repeatedly about a category of problem that had not yet produced an exception. The Cascade Protocol worked because it was designed against the specific vulnerabilities that spacefaring species shared, the ones evolution produced when intelligence developed in environments less punishing than the one that had made humans. It collapsed communication nodes. It generated localized gravitational interference that scrambled unshielded biological tissue at the cellular level. It required the targeted species to hold formation under conditions that any crew experiencing the protocol's full effect would find unsurvivable past the third minute. 7 species had dissolved under it. Not because they were weak exactly, but because the Cascade Protocol was designed for species whose biology matched the galactic norm. Sorvin had cataloged humanity's biology in his preliminary file. He had noted the radiation tolerance, higher than any Drivathi baseline by a factor that had seemed, at the time of filing, merely curious rather than operationally significant. The Drivathi sensor protocols read biological tolerance through the standard cellular stress index, a measurement calibrated to the median tolerance of the 7 prior recorded species. And against that index, humanity's reading had sat at a value the calibration scale had not been designed to display gracefully. The number had appeared on his preliminary readout as an outlier flagged in pale amber, the color reserved for data points the system could not immediately fit into its prior pattern. He had glanced at the amber, made his note, and moved on, in the way a chronicler moves on past the small anomalies that long experience teaches will resolve themselves into the ordinary range once a fuller data set is gathered. The fuller data set had not resolved the amber. It had deepened it. He had noted the pack bonding behaviors, the tendency of human crews to maintain functional cohesion under conditions that should have produced individual self-preservation responses and individual dispersal. He had noted the pain endurance documented in field reports from the border skirmishes 2 years prior, where human Marines had continued operating with injuries that a Drivathi medical officer had marked in a separate report as incompatible with sustained activity. He had noted, almost as an aside, the sounds the human crews made when they were under pressure, the low rhythmic vocalizations that their own records called singing, which seemed to serve a communicative and cohesion function that their command structure alone could not account for. He had filed all of it. He had not, in his preliminary assessment, marked any of it as a threat-level consideration. The Drivathi field files on the coalition border skirmishes contained scanner imagery that, on review, displayed humans operating in environments his own physiology would have found incapacitating within minutes. Cold environments where the ambient temperature read at the lower edge of survivable Drivathi range, on which human Marines had nonetheless been recorded conducting maintenance work without visible degradation. Pressure differentials at the boundary of what the standard pressure suit calibration could compensate for, in which human engineers had been observed performing precise external repairs across uninterrupted intervals of 43 standard minutes. The instrumentation logs were unambiguous. The implications of those logs, when laid against the Cascade Protocol's threshold assumptions, had been the questions Sorvin had not asked. He had been, he now understood, insufficiently attentive to the way these traits combined under pressure rather than operating separately. The species' biology and behavior did not exist as separate columns in a comparative table. They existed as a single integrated response system, evolved on a planet that had spent 4 billion years culling everything that could not survive the conditions. And that integrated response activated under pressure in ways the comparative table did not predict, because the table itself had been built on the implicit assumption that biology and behavior could be considered separately. They could not be, not for this species. He had not been alone in this. The war itself had begun with a border dispute over transit rights through the Palara corridor, which was the kind of dispute that the Dravathi Council resolved every few decades by the straightforward application of fleet presence and formal demand. Other species complied. The coalition's initial response had been to negotiate, then to hold, then to do something that Sorvin had seen only once in his career from a species facing a Dravathi fleet notification. They had refused, not strategically, not as a feint. They had simply, as a collective, refused. Sorvin had recorded that refusal in the file and noted it with a slight taxonomic curiosity, the way he might note an animal that did not startle at an approach that should have triggered flight. He had not yet understood what it meant. He understood it now. Drew Patel had been the 3rd Coalition Fleet's senior commander for 8 months when the Cascade Protocol's first deployment hit the outlying stations at Marin Point. Sorvin knew this from the service records the Coalition had transmitted during the initial contact protocols, a transparent act that Veth had described in Sorvin's hearing as the behavior of a species that does not understand what it has just handed us. Drew was 43 years old. He had spent 21 of those years in Coalition service, starting as a navigation officer on a cargo and survey vessel operating the outer system runs, the unglamorous postings that accumulated competence without accumulating glory. His performance reviews were consistent, thorough, patient, disinclined to motion that was not necessary. A senior evaluator had noted, 9 years into his career, that Commander Patel had a quality difficult to name precisely, which the evaluator had finally characterized as, he finishes things. He was not the most decorated officer in the Coalition fleet. He was not the youngest or the most strategically celebrated. He was the one who had taken the duty assignment in the Palara corridor when no one of senior rank had wanted it, and he had held his fleet together across 8 months of attritional skirmishing with a patience that the Dravathi engagement commanders had catalogued as resignation. It was not resignation. Sorvin knew this now. He suspected he had known it at a lower register even when he filed the preliminary notes. There is a quality in patience that looks like waiting to lose only to observers who have never seen what happens when a human has decided not to stop. Navigator Lise Okoro had served with Drew for 4 of his 8 months in the corridor posting. She occupied the seat 2 stations to his left on the bridge of the flagship Steadfast Hand, a vessel whose name struck every Dravathi reader of the fleet manifest as slightly ungrammatical and oddly earnest, a fact that Lise had apparently been aware of and had found, according to testimony gathered later, pretty on the nose, honestly. She was 31, had the navigational reflexes that came from growing up in a family that ran atmospheric survey craft in unpredictable weather systems, and she had a habit of naming things she found funny in a flat, quiet voice that did not invite the people around her to laugh unless they were already inclined to. Drew was inclined to, reliably, which was why she kept doing it. This was, Sorvin reflected, a form of pack bonding, whose utility he had not immediately understood, and which the Dravathi file on human crew dynamics had described only as informal communication patterns of uncertain function. The function, as Sorvin understood it now, was this: that humor in conditions of high stress served as a binding agent. It said, in a register that bypassed formal communication, that the person next to you had chosen to remain present enough to find something worth naming. It was, functionally, a signal of continued cohesion at moments when cohesion had every biological reason to collapse. He had noted this in his files. He had not weighted it correctly. The bridge audio recordings recovered later from the Steadfast Hands secondary log contained measured pulses of what the recovery instruments had initially registered as ambient harmonic interference, until a junior Dravathi audio analyst had cross-referenced the patterns against the Human Cultural Index and identified the patterns as singing. Two crew voices, low and slightly rough, holding a long phrase that rose and fell against the rhythm of the bridge's alarm tones. Sorvin had read the analyst's report and had made a small additional note. The singing had occurred at the 7th and 12th minute marks of the engagement, both moments at which the Dravathi tactical model would have predicted command coherence to begin failing. Ember of the Marathi was the third thing Sorvin had filed and not fully understood. The Marathi were a small species by galactic standards, few in number, technically capable, but militarily modest, known in the Council's records primarily as a species that had survived the early period of Dravathi expansion by making themselves useful rather than resistant. Ember was their delegate to the coalition, a posting that the Dravathi file on the Marathi had characterized as a routine diplomatic assignment. What the file had not recorded, because no one on the council had thought to ask, was that Ember's home station at Vedri Crossing had been among the transit points absorbed during the expansion period her grandparents' generation had lived through. That she had grown up on accounts of what had been traded away for survival. That she had watched the human fleet hold the Palara corridor with the specific attention of someone who had spent a lifetime knowing what holding looked like from the outside and what it cost. She had not said this to anyone in the council's presence. She had watched and she had stayed. Councillor Veth authorized the first Cascade deployment 14 days after the formal declaration. She did so from the Fleet Command relay station at the edge of the corridor, reading the order into the record with the same flat procedural clarity she brought to every formal action. And she noted for the record that the prior 7 applications of the protocol had taken an average of 6 days to produce a species' full-scale withdrawal or collapse. She expected the humans to take slightly longer given their coalition structure, and had filed a preliminary estimate of 9 to 12 days. The humans took 8 months to reduce to 41 vessels. This is the part of the file that Sorvin had found himself returning to, even before the final engagement. Not the number of vessels lost, which was large, and not the rate of attrition, which was consistent with Cascade protocol projections, but the fact that the fleet had continued to operate as a fleet. Its internal communications had stayed coherent. Its strategic decisions had stayed coordinated. The ships that could no longer fight had transferred their remaining crew to ships that could, sometimes under conditions that the Dravathi medical assessment had calculated as fatal for anyone attempting the transfer, and the transfers had succeeded anyway because the crews making them had not stopped. Drew had lost 48 crew members at Marin Point's second engagement. He had lost 63 more across the 6 months that followed, including the entire complement of the frigate Perseverance, which had covered a retreat by simply refusing to move until everyone behind it had cleared the engagement zone. He had sent a formal notation of commendation to the Coalition's record service for the Perseverance's crew, and then he had continued. It was during the 5th month of the campaign that Leas had been at her station when Drew received the personal communication flag on his secondary terminal. The message was from the Coalition's record office. It was a standard casualty notification, the kind that fleet commanders received as a matter of course when personnel connected to their service record were listed. She had not read it, which was not her terminal. She had noticed, from 2 stations away, that Drew had read it, sat still for 30 seconds, and then set the flag to archived and returned to the tactical display without speaking. She had not asked. He had not told her. She had made a notation in her personal log that evening, 3 sentences long, ending with, "He's still here. We're still here. That's what there is." The message had been a casualty notification for one Ravi Patel, listed as a civilian colonist aboard the transport vessel Suraj Crossing, which had been destroyed in the second week of the campaign during the Dravathi fleet's clearing operation at the Marin colony. Ravi was 28 years old. He had taken the colony posting 8 months before the war began because he was a soil engineer, and there was soil there that needed work. He was Drew's younger brother. Sorvin had found this in the secondary personnel files, cross-referenced through the casualty index, and he had sat for a long time after finding it, thinking about the 30 seconds Drew had spent still at his console and then returned to the work. He had not thought about it in his preliminary assessment. He was thinking about it now. The Cascade Protocol's final deployment came 22 days after Veth authorized the second phase saturation orders. Sorvin had been present at the council session where she had issued the authorization. She had looked out at the assembled delegates with a satisfaction that was not quite triumphant, only settled, the expression of an administrator whose projections had held. The short-lived, she had said, using the notation the council had adopted in place of the species designation as a procedural shorthand, are at operational minimum. 41 vessels. Reduced command capacity. The protocol's final application will conclude this engagement inside standard resolution parameters. She was not wrong about the 41 vessels or the reduced command capacity. Sorvin had the figures. What she had not factored, what the Cascade Protocol's designers had not factored when they built it against the biological tolerances of the 7 species it had previously resolved, was the specific detail that Sorvin had noted in his preliminary file and marked as merely curious: the radiation tolerance. The Cascade Protocol worked partly through localized field emission that disrupted biological tissue. Every crew that had ever faced it had experienced the field's effect as incapacitating within the first 3 to 4 minutes, which meant no crew could maintain station under the protocol's full saturation long enough to do anything to reverse it. The protocol was self-sustaining once deployed because it removed the possibility of sustained crew action before any sustained crew action could be taken. This was correct for Dravathi crews. It was correct for the Palasi Compact's crews. It was correct for 6 other species in the file. It required a crew that could absorb 3 times the Dravathi lethal threshold and continue to function across 19 minutes to stop being correct. Drew had been at his console when the full cascade saturation hit. Lias had been at hers. Sorvin had the bridge telemetry, recovered during the subsequent salvage assessment, and he had read it the way he read everything. Carefully, looking for what it said and what it refused to say. The bridge sensors recorded in real time biological data that the Dravathi medical readers categorized in 3 colors: green for nominal function, amber for stress within the operating envelope, and red for collapse into terminal cellular failure. Across 19 minutes of saturation, Drew's biometric trace had moved from green into amber at the 2nd minute, deepened toward the red threshold at the 7th minute, and held precisely at the boundary, neither crossing it nor returning, for 12 continuous minutes. The medical officer who later reviewed the trace, a senior Dravathi physician named Telos, had filed a notation that read, "This pattern is not survival. It is not collapse. It is something the index does not have a category for." He had requested formally that the Medical Taxonomy Committee establish a 4th color for future use. What it said was that the radiation field from the Cascade Protocol's full deployment registered on the steadfast hands instruments at 2 minutes and 41 seconds into the engagement. That the ship's hull shielding reduced the exposure to something that a Drivathi crew would have found lethal in 4 to 6 minutes, and that the human crew's biological tolerance was sufficient to allow continued function past that point. That Drew had initiated the tactical interface shift at the 4-minute and 9-second mark, pulling the fleet into a formation the Drivathi engagement commanders had not seen before, because it required a fleet commander to understand exactly what the Cascade Protocol was doing to the space around it, and to do the specific thing that the protocol's designers had never accounted for, because it required staying conscious long enough to do it. The Cascade Protocol generated its field from 19 emitter nodes arranged in a pattern that produced overlapping zones of saturation across the target fleet's likely dispersal area. The pattern was stable because it had to be stable to maintain coverage as a targeted species scattered. It had never needed to account for a targeted species that moved toward the emitter nodes instead of away from them, because no crew in the protocol's history had been functional enough past the field's first 4 minutes to navigate toward anything with precision. Drew's fleet moved toward the nodes at reduced speed because 22 of the original 41 vessels had been lost in the first phase and 4 more of the remaining 19 were operating on minimal drive capacity. Lais was at her navigation panel, which she later described in the debrief record as hot to the touch and reading wrong on the secondary monitors, which I was ignoring because the primary monitors were what mattered, and the primary monitors were saying we were on course. The Drivathi engagement officer who reviewed the navigation logs had attempted to model the precision of her plotting against expected human degradation curves, and had reached a final figure that he had submitted to the analytics group, with a notation requesting that they verify it against the recovery instruments because the figure could not be correct. The figure was correct. Across the 19 minutes of full saturation, Lise Okoro's plotted course corrections had landed within an aggregate margin of error that read, in the analytics group's standard scale, as below 0.1%. Her hands were steady in the telemetry record. They did not become unsteady at any point during the 19 minutes. Drew's voice appeared in the bridge audio log at the 6-minute mark. He said, to no one in particular or to everyone, in a tone that the audio analysis registered as level, keep them tight. We don't need to be fast, we need to be on course. That was the only instruction he gave during the 19 minutes that the recovery telemetry captured in full. The rest was navigation data, course corrections relayed to the other surviving vessels, and the instrumentation record of 19 emitter nodes being entered from an angle their deployment pattern made it impossible to saturate, one by one, as Drew's fleet held the configuration Lais had plotted and did not break it. At the 11-minute mark, the Drivathi engagement commander's fleet-wide communication log showed the first notation that something was wrong. At the 14-minute mark, a second notation, flagged at priority level, said that the human fleet's position relative to the emitter network was producing interference in the protocol's saturation zones. At the 17-minute mark, the engagement commander requested guidance from the relay station, which was receiving the real-time feeds with a 7-second transmission delay. At the 19-minute mark, the Cascade Protocol's field collapsed inward at 3 of the 19 emitter nodes simultaneously, and the collapse cascaded, and the whole formation went dark. The collapse, as recorded by the engagement commander's primary scanner array, registered first as a series of 3 small pulses on the standard threat display, then as a rapidly expanding pattern of failures that propagated through the emitter network in geometric sequence, each node losing coherence as the overlapping field zones from its neighbors disappeared. The visual representation, which the Dravathi tactical officers had watched on a holographic projection with the calm attention of professionals observing an instrument they had operated reliably across decades, became, in those few seconds, the visual representation of an instrument disassembling itself. 14 vessels came out the other side. 14 vessels with functioning weapons. Sorvin had checked that number 6 times. The Dravathi engagement commander did not order a second engagement. This was not cowardice on his part, Sorvin noted in the record. It was the correct response of an experienced officer who had just watched his primary tactical asset stop working and who did not have an alternative ready. He held his fleet at distance and transmitted the full battle record to the relay station, which transmitted it to Veth, who transmitted it to the council with a request for emergency session. Veth read the battle record in her private office before the council convened. Sorvin did not know exactly what she thought while she read it, because he had not been there. But he knew what she said when she reached the council chamber, because he had been in the lower gallery, and he had his recorder running. She stood at the podium for a moment before she spoke. "The short-lived," she began. And then she stopped and started again and said, "The human fleet has demonstrated a capability inconsistent with prior assessment. We will need to revise." That was the entire sentence. Sorvin had transcribed it verbatim. It was not the language of a person who had been broken or humiliated. It was the language of a person whose model had encountered a case outside its parameters, and who was, with visible difficulty, updating the model. He respected this about Veth on reflection. There are people who would have asked for another engagement rather than say the word revise in open session. She had said it in open session, clearly, and then she had sat down. The session ran for 4 hours. Sorvin catalogued it all. The question before the council was not whether to continue the war. 14 functioning human vessels with weapons against a Dravathi fleet that had just watched its primary tactical asset fail was not a situation in which continuation was the obvious choice. The question was what terms to offer, and to whom, and under what framing. It was at the 3rd hour of the session that Ember requested the floor. The Dravathi protocol officer noted for the record that the Marathi delegate's request was procedurally unusual, as Marathi had observer status and not formal speaking rights at emergency sessions. Veth looked across the chamber at Ember for a moment, then authorized the request. It was the second thing she had done in that session that surprised Sorvin, and he marked both. Ember stood at the delegate podium below the main floor and spoke for 6 minutes. She spoke about the Vedri Crossing transit stations, which she did not call her stations or her people's stations, but which everyone in the chamber with any historical literacy understood had been those things. She spoke about what it meant to watch a species hold a position that it had every reason to abandon. She spoke about Drew's fleet specifically, about 41 vessels that had become 22 and then kept operating as a fleet, about the things the Dravathi casualty records showed about human command coherence under conditions the Cascade Protocol was designed to make impossible. She did not use charged language. She used the language of a person describing something she had watched carefully. "I have watched this species," Ember said, "for 3 years, 8 months, and 12 days, which is 1 day longer than your council has had a file on them. I watched them before your file opened because I was watching for something specific. I wanted to know if they would stop. I know now that they do not stop. I believe the council would benefit from knowing this before it decides what it intends to do next." The session closed with a resolution to transmit formal terms to the Coalition Fleet Command within 72 hours. Drew received the terms aboard the Steadfast Hand, which was anchored at the edge of the corridor alongside 13 other vessels that were, in varying degrees, not quite as functional as their crew manifests claimed. He read the terms at his console. He passed them to Lise, who read them and said, "Huh," and then said, "The navigation note in Section 7 is going to need rewording because it assumes our original fleet boundaries, which are different now." Drew said that was a good point. He flagged Section 7 and sent it back with a single annotation. He did not celebrate. He did not speak to the crew. He wrote the annotation, filed the document, and then sat at his console for a moment with his hands flat on the surface, looking at nothing in particular, the way he had sat for 30 seconds once before when the casualty flag had come in. Lise watched from 2 stations away and did not say anything. After a moment, he turned back to the tactical display, which still showed the emitter network positions where the Cascade protocol had collapsed, and he looked at those positions for a long time. Then, he drafted a request to the Council for a formal acknowledgement of the crew of the Perseverance in the term's preamble. They included it. Veth had approved the addition without comment. Sorvin had noted this in the file. The signing took less time than anyone expected. Drew signed for the Coalition. Veth signed for the Council. Ember witnessed for the Mirathi, which was, again, procedurally unusual, and which Veth authorized without audible hesitation, and Sorvin marked this also as the third thing that had surprised him in 3 days, which was 3 more surprises than he usually catalogued in a given month. After the signing, the Council's protocol officers began clearing the chamber. The delegates filed out. Drew remained at his table for a moment, looking at the treaty document, and Lise waited near the door with the same patience she brought to navigation problems, which was the patience of someone who knew the calculation was running and trusted it to finish. Drew stood, picked up the document, looked at it one more time, and set it back on the table. The protocol officers would file it. His job was done. Ember was still in the chamber when Drew moved toward the door. She was not in his direct path, but she was not in it either. He slowed, and she looked up at him with those large, slow eyelids, and she said, quietly, the way she said everything, "We were watching." Drew said, "I know." She said, "I want you to know that what we saw is what we're going to say we saw. That's important to us." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that the chamber's ambient recording caught, but that Sorvin found difficult to categorize precisely. Somewhere between gratitude and the specific tiredness of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just put it down. He said, "Thank you." Then he walked out and Lise fell into step beside him, and Sorvin watched them go from the lower gallery, where he'd been seated with his recorder for the 4th time in a week, and he thought about what he was going to write. He returned to his archive that evening and opened the file marked "The Short-Lived" and looked at the label for a long time. The label rendered in standard Drevathai archival script in the slightly compressed glyphs reserved for species classifications sat at the head of the file with the confidence the file's contents no longer supported. He read the glyphs, the way one reads a sentence in an old language one has spoken since infancy, registering each individual character and the assumptions each character carried. Brevity, fragility, negligible duration. Each glyph the bearer of a settled prior judgment. Each glyph wrong. Then he opened a new notation field and began to revise the file's primary designation header. He worked slowly, the way he worked everything, because he was a chronicler, and chroniclers did not rush the record. He pulled the preliminary biological assessments he had filed and added the notation he should have added when he first recorded the radiation tolerance data, that the figure was not merely curious, but operationally significant in any scenario involving the Cascade Protocol's field parameters. He pulled the behavioral notes on pack bonding and added his revised assessment that the function of cohesion behaviors under high stress was not informal or uncertain, but was in fact the mechanism by which human crews maintained command coherence past the biological point where other species dissolved into individual self-preservation. He pulled the note on the vocalizations, the singing, and he thought for a while about how to describe what it was for. And then he wrote, "Function appears to be the maintenance of collective identity under conditions that would otherwise reduce cohesion to zero, and in this, the species may have no analog in the current galactic record." He pulled the note on endurance and wrote carefully that the figure of 3 times the Dravathi lethal radiation threshold maintained across 19 minutes of full cascade saturation was not an outlier in the human biological record, but was consistent with a pattern of endurance past biological norms that appeared throughout the species' documented history in medical records, in combat after action reports, in the accounts of their own explorers and colonists, in the records of a solar system that had spent 4 billion years building creatures capable of surviving it, and that perhaps the Council's assessment had failed to take seriously enough the implications of what it meant to come from a place like that. He saved those notes and sat for a while longer. The last notation he wrote that night was brief. He did not include it in the formal file. He wrote it on a personal recording surface that he slid into the cabinet beside his chair, where he kept the things that were true but not yet ready to be official. He wrote, "The Dravathi file on this species was opened with a label that assumed their brevity was their defining quality. The label was wrong. Their brevity is not what defines them. What defines them is what they do with it. The file should have said that from the beginning. It will say so now." He set the stylus down. In the corridor outside the treaty chamber, Drew Patel walked beside Lise Okoro toward the dock where the shuttle was waiting, and he did not talk about the treaty or the terms or the Cascade Protocol or the 19 minutes. He did not talk about his brother. Lise did not prompt him. They walked in the specific silence of 2 people who have been in each other's company, long enough that silence is its own kind of conversation, and at the dock entrance, waiting for the pressure doors to cycle, Lise said very quietly, in the voice she used for things she was going to say only once, "He'd have wanted to know it worked." Drew said nothing. He looked at the pressure door for a moment while it cycled. Then he said, "Yeah." The door opened. They went through it. Sorvin Kale filed the updated record the following morning. The primary designation header now read, in the formal notation that would be distributed to every council archive and every diplomatic mission in the Dravathi sphere of contact, not the short-lived, but by their given name, followed by a single appended line that had not appeared in any prior record of the species. The line read, "Endurance class, unclassified. No existing galactic baseline sufficient." He closed the file and held it for a moment before he sent it. Then he sent it.